said it happened.
What do you mean when you say Jesus said it happened?
Well, like in oh man, you're testing me here. Matthew 19. When he
I
talks
say.
about, like in Matthew 19 when he's talking about marriage and divorce, and he says God made them both male and female. You know, I'm going to believe Jesus before I believe some 15-year-old kid who says that wasn't true.
Okay. What are some other implications? Gary.
Well, if there's no creator, then are we answerable to anybody? Well, who's to say what man's standard should be? Who are you to say? Why should we have morals?
Right.
You know, if there's not, and like you said, there's not a designer, then we're kind of moral free agents. We kind of do what we want. There shouldn't be a law. Who's to say I couldn't kill anybody? Why not? You know what I mean? Just things like that.
Well,
Yep.
Also, if we've evolved from these simplistic creatures, then our morals should be evolving as well. And that means that we don't have what we need to survive if we're constantly evolving.
Good point. Very good point.
But Brad, don't people try to answer those 2 points by saying that that they do look at God as creator, but they do believe in evolution, and they tie it in together as theistic evolution, to where they get the best of both worlds, I guess, so to speak.
Right. And that's what I was getting with you a minute ago when I mentioned the fact that, okay, you know, Adam and Eve, maybe that's just a story. Why is it important that that's not a story? What did Adam and Eve ultimately bring into the world?
Sin.
Sin, okay? So Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world. Because of that sin, what did God introduce into the world?
Christ.
A plan for redemption.
That's
Right.
So if you remove that critical element, guys, think about what we're left with. You've basically taken the entire scheme of redemption away from the Bible. I'm going to ask you, bear patient with me for just a second. I didn't bring one of the books in. I want to grab a textbook. All right. I want to start in a pretty odd spot in talking about the origin of man. Somebody tell me why I would assert that ultimately the teaching of man evolving is a form of racism. Why would I say that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Could it be that we say that the origin of man begins in Africa, in that general region, and then people say that the black race hasn't actually evolved to where the whites are?
Absolutely. I can go right next door into my office and grab some of my biology textbooks. And all of those biology textbooks are going to have the same basic beginnings for mankind. And that is, allegedly, we came up out of Africa. The reason, I'll go ahead and give you the reason why they say that. The reason why they're even making that claim is because, allegedly, the oldest fossils they've ever found are from Africa. So they're basically saying that's the motherhood state. Now, when you think about all of the missing links that we're going to look at today, in fact, let me throw a couple on the screen just so you guys can see what we're talking about. Let's see. We'll go way, way back. Here we go. I don't have Dean to be talking, so somebody there may have to talk for just a second.
It'll be a quiet class.
And we all just laugh.
All right. Let's see. My computer is not showing. I mean, do you guys see a slide up there?
Yeah.
King Anthropus Platyops?
Yep, that's good.
Okay. Here's the things I want you to notice about this particular thing. We'll talk more about him later, but that particular creature, you'll notice it has a lot of hair and what color skin?
Black, brown.
Very dark. Okay. If you think about evolution in this way, they're saying that we evolved out of Africa as very dark-skinned, hairy creatures. Eventually, we lost our hair, and we further evolved into white men. Guys, I don't care how you slice it. That is teaching that the Caucasian race is further evolved in their minds than anything else. That's racism. That is basically saying one of these is superior to the other. You all will hear a lot of people make the claim that Charles Darwin never ever said that we came from monkeys. And to a small extent, in his first book, they're right. His first book being Origin of Species. Because in that particular book, he didn't even deal with man. All he dealt with were plants and animals. It was his second book that he specifically dealt with man. And the title of that book was The Descent of Man. It's in that particular book where he makes several claims that we came from monkeys. We came from, as he would say, the old world simian stem of monkeys. And he aligns monkeys in his tree of life closer to what he calls the Negro race than what he would call the European. So hopefully you understand why I would say that, to me, that's racism. And hopefully that bothers you some, because, guys, that's, the Bible's teaching there's only one race, and that is the human race. And I think a lot of people need to hear that, and I think a lot of pulpits need to be preaching the fact that, God created all men in his image. Questions, comments on that?
How would you then, Brad, when I preach, I don't use the word race either. I use the word ethnic group.
Okay.
Because I believe that I know there's only one race. So how do you deal with the fact that we use race so much? We do. I mean, it's just what we use, what we say. Do you think that's correct or incorrect?
When I use it here in just a moment, we're going to be using it the way that society uses it.
Right.
And that is as skin color. Do I think that that's correct? No. To me, my wife will tell you, when I fill out an application or, something and it says race, I always write in human.
Right.
Because I'm of the human race. I'm not all this other mess. I'm of the human race. But, Jerry, you bring up a good point. Is it real, and do people in our congregations and in our society recognize it? Absolutely. We would be kidding ourselves if we thought, hey, the race issue is not an issue. It is. It shouldn't be, but it is. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, the South, so to speak. And here in Nashville, we have what we call, and, granted it shouldn't necessarily be this way. Thanks, girl. We have black churches and white churches. And they're not truly black churches and white churches. But the reality of it is there are congregations where it is known that the majority of people are going to be dark-skinned and the majority of people are going to be lighter-skinned. One of my favorite congregations in the world is a place in Jacksonville, Florida. They have 31 ethnic groups in that one congregation. It is the most diverse congregation I've ever been to. and it's phenomenal. I mean, I love the fact that when you look out, they are a family from all over the world. They got people from Congo, from Malaysia, from Russia, you name it. And it's great, because to me, that's the way the family of God should look.
What church is that, Brad?
Arlington, or Arrington,
The Arlington Church of Christ?
one of their elders is a man by the name of Bill Davis.
Uh-huh.
And it's either Arrington or Arlington, I forget which.
It would be Arlington.
Okay. Are you from Jacksonville?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know which congregation I'm talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Other comments, thoughts, questions?
Well, I guess I need to clarify myself. I don't mean that it's not a real problem. Obviously it is. But don't you
Okay.
think from the pulpit, we should, I mean, aren't we supposed to influence people? You know what I mean? So instead
Yeah,
of
for
using
good,
terminology
absolutely.
like that, like bringing people along with better words. You know, when people know better, they do better.
Yes.
So if we use better words in the pulpit, I think maybe the congregation will start seeing themselves as, you know,
Absolutely. 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 And that's why whenever I talk on this topic, I always try to remind people I'm going to be using society's definition of race, but there is only one race, and that is mankind or humankind or whatever you want to call us. I just saw John step out. I'm assuming he had an issue.
Kids,
But I'm going to... Oh, okay. Can one of you guys talk for just a second?
Go ahead and talk, Chuck.
All right, come on, Chuck. All right.
I
I think I'll talk.
It didn't work. Hold on. We're going to try again.
Somebody do your Gene Meadows impersonation.
Double, double.
Oh, man.
Okay. I'm assuming you guys can see it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. I apologize for this picture. It is not the one I normally use. This one's a lot more immodest. Normally I have this young lady's legs covered up a whole lot more. But I want us to talk about the origin of races for just a moment. So here's the irony. The irony is evolution is teaching a form of racism. But we know that there are different colored people. So the obvious question is, how did we get here? How do you explain from a biblical perspective all the different colors of people around us today? Even within your class, you've got 6 people, 6 different quote-unquote colors, all the way from fair skin to dark skin. If we really did come from just 2 people, how do we explain that? Now, first and foremost, why would I say we came from 2 people?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve.
Okay? Adam and Eve, in fact, if you look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, somebody read that for me.
Now the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the living.
She was mother of all living. That's pretty plain. That tells you right there that Eve is going to be, all of the lineage of humanity is going to come through Eve. That being the case, we're then stuck with this idea of, okay, how do we explain light-colored people and dark-colored people if everybody came from Eve? Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. In order to answer that, we look at what causes skin color. We know that it is a biological pigment known as melanin. So, for instance, every one of you in that room has melanin in your skin, in the melanocytes of your cells, in melanocyte cells. the amount of melanin you have in those cells is dependent on two people, your mom and your dad. So those of you who are very fair-skinned, your parents were also very fair-skinned, did not contribute a whole lot of melanin into your genes. Geneticists have come along and they basically said, okay, we're going to designate letters. We're going to use letters to differentiate how much melanin somebody has in their skin. So, for instance, if somebody is really, really dark-skinned, I'm going to use my arrow on my computer if I can get it. Right down here at the bottom, you'll see capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B. That would be the darkest skin possible. Whereas if somebody is considered little a, little b, those little letters would indicate recessive genes, somebody who's very, very fair-skinned. What do we call somebody who has no melanin in their skin? Albino. And if it's a true albino, you're going to see kind of almost a pinkish hue. And it's not really a pink from color. It's actually, their skin is translucent. You're looking through their skin to the capillary bed below. You're actually seeing blood passage. That's what gives it that pinkish hue. Now, let's look for just a minute at a combination and see if we can figure out, if we had two people, we'll call them Adam and Eve. Is there a way that we can get all of the different skin colors around us today? For instance, what if Adam and Eve were both big A, big A, big B, big B? They would both be extremely dark-skinned. What would all their children be?
Extremely dark-skinned.
Big A, big A, big B, big B. This is, I mean, as crazy as it sounds, it's just like doing math. What about this one? What if Adam and Eve were both little a, little b, little b? Again, all their children would be little a, little b, right? They would be very, very fair-skinned. Now, that's not what we see around us. Even though every summer they send out Vacation Bible School packets that have this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Eve and this fair-skinned, usually brown-headed male, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but that ain't right. Period. What if, well, first off, we know 55% of the world's population is Caucasoid, 37% is Mongoloid, 8% is Negroid. What if God used a dark-skinned and a light-skinned person? On the screen you see what's called a Punnett square. It is what geneticists use to figure out skin colors. We're going to say that Adam was very dark-skinned, and if you look across where the arrow is moving, this would be Adam's genes across the top. Eve is down the left-hand side. She was very fair-skinned. So all of hers are little letters. What we do in order to predict offspring is we take, for instance, these genes from Eve, these genes from Adam, and we combine them in this box. And you'll notice if you do that for this entire scenario, every single one of them is going to be right down the middle, tan. Now you got to ask yourself, is that what we see today? Is everybody right down the middle tan? The answer is no. But what if God had started out with a mixture? Meaning, what if God started out with two, and I'm going to use this term just kind of as a reference, but two mocha-colored individuals. In science, we would call this heterozygous. What all can you get? What is the color combinations that you can get from those two people?
Every color combination.
There it is on the screen. In your book, I don't know why they did this. They actually reversed out the colors to blue. But this is actually a much, much better. On page 200. But this gives you what we're talking about. From just two individuals, we can go from one very, very fair skin down here at the bottom, 4 lighter colored, 6 tan, 4 darker brown, and 1 very dark skin, all for a total of 16. Now guys, I can get you that from 2 people. How many walked off the ark?
8 souls.
8. Do you think that there had already been some mixing of genes by the time the ark came around?
I think so.
You got 1,500 years, guys. 1,500 years for all these different colors to mate and make back on themselves, to make darkers and lighters and all kinds of different colors. You got 8 people walking on that boat that have a mixture of genes. You begin to understand why we got so many colors around us today. And in fact, today, you think about this. Today you can get in a car, a plane, a train, and within 3 hours you can be in a different culture, and you can marry between cultures, and you begin to understand why you got this rainbow. Questions or comments so far? Okay.
What's the term you used again for mocha,
Heterozygous. Heterozygous simply means there is a mixture of colors.
Okay.
Heterozygous is a mixture of any kind of gene, actually. Now, let's talk for just a minute about what might be a stumbling block for some people. This sounds really good on paper, okay? Everybody looks at that and they say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. The reality of it is, would you say that there are a predominance of dark-skinned people around the equator and fair-skinned people in Europe?
Yes.
Absolutely. So how do we explain that? Some people would say that's evolution. That matches up with this idea of coming out of Africa. How would you explain that to a 15-year-old?
Difference in the amount of sun they get.
Absolutely. In order to explain it to a 15-year-old or a 55-year-old, what you've got to do is you've got to go back to an event that happened in Genesis chapter 11. Somebody tell me what happened in Genesis 11.
Bunch of babbling going on.
Yeah. Where God scattered people in their tongues.
We call it the Tower of the Tower of Babel. Just kidding, Dean. In all seriousness, God confused their languages. So let's think for just a moment. Let's say we've got 1,000 people. And they find each other at the base of this tower simply because they're speaking the same language. Suddenly, they're all speaking Swahili. They migrate down towards Africa. Does it make sense after just a few short generations that they are primarily going to have dark skin in that particular clan of people? Absolutely. Here's why. The melanin that makes their skin dark also protects them from the sun's harmful UV rays. The more melanin you've got, the more protection you've got. So if you've got 1,000 people at the base of the Tower of Babel, they're all different colors. You've got light skins, you've got dark skins, you've got mochas that all go down towards Africa. The people with the darkest skin are going to have an advantage. They're going to have a natural advantage of not getting skin cancers and such. All right, let's flip it for just a moment. What if we had 1,000 people at the base of the Tower of Babel, all different colors, and they all speak Swedish? They all migrate up there. If you look on the screen, this is a map. You'll notice the top shows sunlight or UV distribution. And you notice the areas like Sweden, they don't get a whole lot of sunlight, do they? And we need sunlight. We actually use it to make what?
Vitamin D?
Vitamin D. You don't have enough vitamin D, you're not going to be able to absorb calcium. You're going to have some major bone deficiencies. Major bone deficiencies. In fact, these are the areas of the world where people still get rickets, where osteoporosis is a problem, where all kinds of bone normalities happen. So you've got, let's say we got 1,000 people. I'm going to draw using my arrow. We think the Tower of Babel was somewhere probably right around the end of my arrow, right here. So they all migrate up here. They don't get a whole lot of sunlight. Does it make sense that after maybe 4, 5, 10 generations, there's going to be a predominance of fair-skinned people there? Absolutely. Because the melanin that makes somebody's skin dark also inhibits their ability to absorb what little sunlight is available. Let's kind of think of it as a filter. Well, if you're filtering out what little sunlight is available, you're not going to be able to produce adequate levels of vitamin D, and eventually you're going to suffer from that. So it makes sense in that environment that eventually you're going to have a predominance of light-skinned people. Where's the only place on the planet where this rule is violated? Where you've got dark-skinned people in an environment that doesn't get a whole lot of sunlight. How about the Eskimos? And where do the Eskimos get their vitamin D from, guys?
Fish.
How about the fish? Now think about that. This thing is so tightly knit, if you really think about it. It all fits beautifully into God's Word if we would just learn it, teach it, and make sure that other people know about it. So the bottom map down here is basically saying predicted skin colors. And that's, in general speaking, that's what we see. But that has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. That has something to do with simply the people were dispersed, and depending on how much melanin you have, it can be an advantage or disadvantage in certain locations. Now, we move ourselves up to the year 2010. Here we are, we're in Sweden. Can Jerry go preach at a church in Sweden?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely he can.
They understand me.
Can Jerry take vitamins that will help supplement vitamin D if he needs it, if he starts feeling weak, or if he starts growing a horn out of his head from bone deficiencies? Absolutely. But the point being, we've got great information now of how and why we would get to this point. So, comments, questions so far?
Wouldn't that speak against evolution then? If people have been living in places like Sweden for so long and they have all these bone deficiencies and lack of vitamin D, when we grow something in our bodies to produce vitamin D?
Absolutely.
Good job.
Why haven't people in Sweden produced, a vitamin D organ that is able to pump in extra? Or for that reason, why haven't people in Africa evolved some elaborate feather covering that will cover their skin and protect them so that they can be, light skinned or whatever skin they want to be? Other thoughts, questions, comments?
Well, from where we started, you could start the argument then that black people were actually more evolved because they had this dark color to protect them, and the light-skinned people didn't.
Well, it's a benefit in Africa, and it's kind of a disadvantage up in Northern Europe. So depending on where you are, you may have the upper hand or the lower hand, depending on what part of the geography you're at.
So the whole theory is blown with just that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I wanted us to start by talking about it. I want to throw out one more thing. It's going to take me just a second to bring it up on my computer. And that's blood type. How many blood types are there? There's 4. Somebody tell me what they are if you remember.
A, B, O, and AB.
There you go. A, B, O, and AB. How in the world do you get 4 blood types if we just came from 2 people? Again, that's a good question, and it's a question that we as teachers, as preachers, should be able to answer. And if I can find the right PowerPoint, we're going to be able to answer. Let's see. That's not it. Give me just a second. There we go. The answer lies in the idea of heterozygous again. So if God had created 2 individuals that were heterozygous for blood types, believe it or not, you can get all 4 from just 2 people. And I think this one's got it. Yes, it does. Here we go. All right. Let me pull back up the PowerPoint. Are we seeing a blue screen? There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. Bible indicates all humans descended from 2 original people, Adam and Eve. However, we know there are 4 human blood types. How is that possible? Types A and B. And I'll blow this up so you guys can see it a little bit better once my gizmo stops. There we go. Types A and B are said to be codominant, which means that they're both dominant to type O, but equal to each other. Thus, anybody that has, for instance, AO blood type is said to be type A. You can be, if somebody says, I'm type A blood, that means they are AA or AO. If somebody is type B, that means they have BB, 1B from mom, 1B from dad. Or they could be BO. B from mom, O from dad, but because the B is dominant, it overrides the O. So if you look at it from that perspective, here's another little chart where if you got Adam up here, and let's say he was AO blood type. You got Eve right here, we'll say she was BO blood type. From 2 people, you can get all 4 blood types. So, does it bother me as a scientist and as a Christian when somebody says, we got 4 blood types and you're saying we came from 2 people? Absolutely not. It makes logical sense to me. Not only is it logical, I can explain it in a very rational, very reasonable way to show that this is how God did it.
Hey, Brad.
All right.
Hey, Brad.
Yes.
On my ignorance on blood type stuff, where does, what's the A negative blood type is on your chart? Or, the
Okay,
positive?
negative. Yeah, the negatives and positives are simply RH factors.
Okay.
And that is a totally different thing from actual blood typing. So, for instance, if you're B positive or B negative, the positive and negative simply mean what factors are binding and what are not binding. But it doesn't have to do with the genetic side of what we're talking about on types, if that makes sense. So, for instance, let's say that let's say you're A and your wife is B. Your children could be AB positive or AB negative, depending on whether they have a factor that adheres to certain molecules or repels them.
Okay.
But they're still AB blood type, if that makes sense. It's factoring is a totally different aspect than typing.
Okay. Got it.
Comments, questions so far?
Brad, it's
All right, guys, well, let's get.
Never mind.
Go ahead.
Well, of course, God knew before man was ever around that he was going to confuse their languages and that they would migrate to different parts of the world. So it just speaks to the designer and his wisdom in creation that he put two heterozygous people in the garden.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and when you look at people in the region where we feel certain the Fertile Crescent was, where we feel certain that a lot of the main events of the Old Testament occurred, we would define those people as being kind of mocha colored. When I would talk to you about somebody from Saudi Arabia or Turkey or from that region, Iran, Iraq, Middle East, those people a lot of times we would define as mocha colored. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, because more than likely that's where all the Old Testament activities took place. That's where Christ was. And even though a lot of times we have fashioned in our minds Jesus being a certain color, skin color, and sometimes we tend to try to make that our own skin color. Realistically, he was probably a whole lot closer to somebody in Iraq, as weird as that sounds. All right, yeah, John?
Are you finding much in the way of controversy or resistance to that chart that you bring up regarding Adam and Eve and their skin type and how we came about with that within the church, like in your seminars and stuff?
I don't find a lot of resistance simply because that is, to me, that's just straight science. You can't really refute that.
Sure.
I do find a little bit of resistance still on occasion from folks who I would consider to be racist. And by that I mean occasionally there'll be comments made to me after a lesson or maybe out in a parking lot by somebody who, some little off-color comment about one race or the other or whatever. But as far as that, teaching in that vein, no, I don't. I really haven't gotten near the reaction I thought I would. But let's be honest, there are some people that are still very much racist one way or the other. It's on all, realistically, it's on everybody's plate. And so if I go somewhere and I teach and the first words out of my mouth are, hey, folks, there's really only one race, there's some people that don't necessarily buy that. And I can't figure out for the life of me, do they honestly think that heaven has an area for dark-skinned people and light-skinned people, or what are they thinking? Because, folks, to me, God created us all in His image. If we obey Him, that's where we get to go.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're going to have a colored section, a non-colored section, or here in Nashville, we have a really big Mexican population. And granted, a large majority of them are illegal immigrants, but occasionally there'll be some nasty comments made against them. And it's kind of, now granted, I don't agree with the fact that they are illegal, because you're breaking laws of the land. But the fact of the matter is, whether they come from Mexico or whether they come from Antarctica or wherever, they're still made in the image and likeness of God. And if they make it to heaven and I make it to heaven, we're going to the same place. Okay. I'm assuming you guys can see a slide up on the screen. Two options. And guys, please understand, when I say this, I've been teaching the origin of man for a long, long time, and there realistically is no other option. Either man came from God, or we evolved, and that God is basically a product of our imagination. And you may say, well, you can be like a Richard Dawkins and say, well, maybe we came from some kind of life that was on a meteor that came here from another planet. Well, but still, you boil it down, either that life came from God or it evolved. Realistically, there's only two options. What I want us to do for a little while today is I want us to look at this idea that we evolved. And I'm going to take you guys through a lot of material in a fairly short amount of time. I do not expect you to remember every single one of these names. I will expect you to know a few things about some of them, and I'll try to stress that to you. This will actually be in two different presentations. This is the first one. The reason I'm showing you this one is because I want you to see how you can logically present this material to even the most backwoods country congregation, and they get it. This is to me, this is some technical information. This is about some stuff that maybe not everybody has interest in, but if you present it in the right way, they understand, they can stay with you, they can follow you, and you can effectively teach people the truth. On the screen, what I've got is simply just basically a hand-done tree, for lack of better terms. It'd be more like, I guess, a stick. But if you look down here at the bottom, in the brown, we've got millions of years ago, so that's starting out 28 million years ago, all the way to present day. And I put a disclaimer here because, when I go and teach in universities, there'll be somebody undoubtedly who'll want to nitpick. Evolutionists themselves can't decide how the tree should be put together. They've got, this group may have a branch over here and this branch coming off here. But from a general perspective, this is probably the most widely accepted. We start down here, Egyptopithecus zeuxis. We go to a guy named Dryopithecus africanus, Ramapithecus brevirostris, Ardipithecus ramidus cadava, Kenyanthropus platyops. Now, let me say this. A lot of times you look at those names and they start kind of scaring you. Don't worry about the names. Normally the names are just telling you where the thing was found and maybe giving you a short description of the creature. Like, for instance, this guy, well, we'll get to him in a minute and I'll tell you why he got his name. This guy right here, Dryopithecus africanus. What continent do you think he was found in? Africa. The Dryopithecus basically means on the dry lands. Egyptopithecus zeuxis, found around the Egypt area. Zeuxis means link, and I'll tell you in a minute why they consider him the link. This one here, Australopithecus afarensis. The Afar, A-F-A-R, is a region in Africa. It's the Afar region. So a lot of times, even though these names look really ugly and weird and dumb to you all, it's kind of like lawyers have their own speak, doctors have their own speak, scientists have their own speak, and once you kind of look at it, you get real comfortable with it, and you understand what they're trying to say. Let's start with this guy. So here's how I'm presenting it to you. We're going to start all the way down here at the bottom. Okay? Egyptopithecus zeuxis. Richard Leakey, Roger Lewin, in commenting on this particular skull and realized there's only one, they said this is the rather monkey-like skull of Egyptopithecus zeuxis. This is the first ape to emerge from the old world monkey stock. Some elements are partially restored. Now, when you look at this, if you look at this skull right here, you're assuming that they found this. No, they didn't find this. What they actually found if you go back and look at the original, they found a few bone fragments, and they made this from a cast. So if you can picture in your mind for just a moment, 11 to 15 bone fragments, and I mean small fragments, and them then coming up with this cast themselves. I put on the screen 2 artist depictions of what this guy would look like. Somebody tell me what you notice. What's the immediate thing you notice?
They're different.
They're very different. You got one that's got a very long, broad nose. You got one that's got a flat nose. The other thing I want you to notice is this. Do either one of them look like they're transitional to becoming human?
No.
These are old world monkeys is all this is. And in fact, that's what they've been relegated as. This one is not a missing link. Now, we make the move up to this next guy. Before we make that move up, though, somebody tell me how many millions of years have passed?
Can't see, it's kind of blurry.
Okay. From, let me show you where I'm reading off of. From right where my arrow is 28 million. Then we go up to 20. 8 million years, guys, and they don't have anything. That's a span of 8 million years, and you don't have, it's not that you don't have like 2 or 3 fossils, you don't have a single fossil representative that fits in an 8 million year gap. There's nothing there. Here is the skull of Dryopithecus africanus. What do you notice about this guy?
Seems to have an underbite.
Definitely has an underbite. Does the skull in any way resemble modern human?
No.
Absolutely not. You can't make an argument for the teeth. You can't make an argument for the eyes. You can't make an argument even from the nose perspective. This guy, again, is clearly on the ape side of the chart. David Pilbeam and Elwin Simons, after they had examined the fossil, so they actually got to look at it, hold it. Now, these are evolutionists. They said this guy was too committed to apedom to be the progenitor of man. So you've got evolutionists who are willing to say, okay, you know what? Realistically, this guy's an ape. So then we go back to our chart. Notice what we're doing. We made another roughly 8 million year jump. So we go from this guy in 28 million years ago to Dryopithecus 20 million years ago, 8 million years, nothing in between. Now we're making another roughly 8 million year leap with nothing in between. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because, number one, if there really were transitions, folks, we should see them. Number two, this is how pitiful and how paltry the fossil record really is. The guy who found this one, he was reading about a story, a fiction, work of fiction, and the story had to do with a prince called Rama. And so he's over in the Egypt area, he's looking around, lo and behold, he comes across these teeth. So you got a lower mandible here, you've got a partial mandible here, you got, this looks like it could probably be a maxilla, upper teeth area. That's all the guy found. He names it Ramapithecus brevirostris, the last name meaning the short-snouted ape of Rama. Tell me something. Does he know whether or not this guy really has a short snout or not?
No way. No.
This is all he's got. Literally, this is all he's got. Are teeth fragments. Can you know what color skin this guy had? Can you know what kind of musculature this guy had? And obviously, I know the answer to all of these is no. But guys, you need to understand, This is the kind of actual fossils they're finding, and then they're making great leaps to something like what's on the screen. I love the way Richard Leakey put it. You'll see the Leakey family name a lot. They are a very well-known archaeologist. He said on the right, a reconstruction of Ramapithecus, which because so few remains have been found, must remain very tentative. Yeah, so few remains have been found. That's all they've got. Those three. And yet somebody comes along and they imagine, for lack of better words, they imagine this guy right here. So you ask yourself, okay, do they have any idea about the length of the arms? No. Do they have any idea whether this guy was upright and walking or down on all fours? No. Do they have any idea if it had opposable thumbs? No. Do they have any idea if it had fur or not? Absolutely not. Do they have any idea about how big the brain case was? No. But they get around it by saying, because so few remains have been found, it must remain very tentative. Next guy. Ardipithecus rhombodus cadavra. How many of you in there have heard of Artie? Yeah. Okay, Artie's fairly recent. You heard about him in the news. Although, realistically, guys, Artie's not very recent. What you are hearing about right now is simply a repackaged and recycled version of something that came out in the 1990s. This is actually a 2001 issue of Time where they were trying to pump up Artie back then. This will tell you, this will date it for you. The Time magazine little corner issue is on Gary Condit's Secret Life. That happened a long time ago. Time magazine, How Apes Became Human. You'll notice down here it gives the scientific name, Ardipithecus rhombodus cadavra. What a new discovery tells scientists about how our oldest ancestors stood on two legs and made an evolutionary leap. I want each one of you to remember this. And the reason I want you to remember this is because you think about how many young people have seen that cover. Because after all, mom and dad subscribe to Time magazine. Comes into, or maybe they walk by the major news display in an airport or at a bookstore. You got Time magazines all over the place with this ape-looking creature in it. I also want you to remember the wording that they're using here. What a new discovery tells scientists about how we stood on two legs and made this evolutionary leap. Then we look at what they actually have. What are the fossils? Just to kind of orient you. You guys can see my arrow, correct?
Yeah.
Over here? Okay. These are all finger bones. You got a single toe bone. You got some molars right here, back teeth. You got part of the head of a femur right here. Everything right in the middle that I'm putting a circle around, all of these are teeth. This is part of a mandible, and these bones right here are long bones of the arm. That's all they've got for Artie. Now, you think first about how many young people saw that cover image, but then how many of those young people actually looked to see what bones they actually had? What was their evidence? And then, check this out. The scientists admit we found these bones from over a period of 5 years from 5 different locations. So all of the bones that you're seeing right here in this picture, they came from 5 different locations. In fact, they cordoned them off according to the 5 different locations. All of these came from one area. These came from an area. This came from an area. The finger bones came from an area, and the single toe bone came from an area. But it gets better. In that particular article, they made this admission. They said, Hale Celeste and his colleagues haven't collected enough bones yet to reconstruct with great precision what cadavra looked like. But they do know that it was about the size of a modern common chimpanzee, which when standing averaged about 4 feet tall. So guys, listen to what he's saying. We haven't collected enough bones yet to know what this guy looks like. And yet we're going to put his picture on the cover of Time, and we're going to put it in a 2-page spread of that magazine. They don't have a clue if this thing looked anything like that. Even by their own admission, we haven't collected enough bones yet to know what this guy looks like. But here's the funniest part, and this is why I wanted you to remember this. They have a picture of the toe bone with a caption underneath it that says, "This toe bone proves the creature walked on 2 legs." Now, I'll just tell you, anatomically speaking, the human foot has 26 bones in it. They have 1. In fact, if you add it up, you got 52 bones just in your feet alone, which is more than a third of your whole body. They have 1. And from that, they say this bone proves the creature walked on 2 legs, and yet, ironically, they admit in this article, they say not only is it separated in time by several 100,000 years, but it was also found some 10 miles away from the rest of those bones. What's the problem, guys?
The only giant leap is not in evolution, but in their imagination.
Absolutely. I mean, even by their own dating methods, they're saying this thing was dated several 100,000 years different from the other bones. And was found 10 miles away. Can you imagine if, let's say, you guys find a bone out back of where you are right now. You get a call from Anthony Warren's at Miller Street. And he says, "You know what, guys, I found a bone here in the back of this church, too. I think it goes with yours." What would you say to him?
Don't come home.
So you lost your mind. But again, notice the admission. Toe bone is not only separated in time by several 100,000 years, but it was also found some 10 miles away from the rest. That is the only bone they have below this femur. They have nothing else from knee down that would give them any idea. And yet, look, guys, the cover says, "What a new discovery tells scientists about how our oldest ancestors stood on 2 legs and made an evolutionary leap." That's media garbage. That's propaganda to the hilt right there. But that's what they're doing. How about the next guy?
Hey, Brad,
Yes, sir.
how long was the jump in between Artie and Ramapithecus brevitorius?
Great question. Approximately 6 to 7 million years. So we keep making these massive jumps. Now, from this point on, from Kenyanthropus all the way to modern man, the jumps are a lot tighter. And this is where they would start speculating, hey, this wasn't that far back. We're getting closer to modern man, blah, 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 blah. Kenyanthropus platyops was discovered by this lady, Meve Leakey, of the famous Leakey family. There is the picture of the skull. What's the first thing you notice about it?
Wow.
Does it look fuzzy to you?
It looks very fuzzy.
Hopefully it does.
Yep.
Somebody, can you guys read the text there? Can somebody read that?
What did she find? An exhaustive study of the Nature article reveals a total of 36 craniodental fossils collected from 4 different locations over a period of 17 years, of which only 6 contained bone fragments. Only 2 of these specimens, the skull and a partial upper jaw, are sufficiently intact to be assigned this new taxon. The authors describe their new finds as a well-preserved temporal bone, 2 partial maxillae, isolated teeth, and most importantly, a largely complete, although disordered cranium.
Okay, guys, look at what I was saying here. She collected 36 craniodental fossils. Craniodental means either teeth or bone. So she's got 36 teeth or bone fossils that came from 4 different locations over 17 years. She put them all together to make one creature. Now, first and foremost, if you're out digging in the desert for 17 years and your job depends on something, do you think you're going to try to find something and glue it together?
Yes.
Absolutely. Notice this. Of the 36 craniodental fossils, only 2 of them, the skull and the partial upper jaw, are sufficiently intact enough to be assigned to this new taxon, this new species. Of the 36 craniodental fossils, only 6 of those contain bone fragments. So realistically, if you cut all the clutter away, she's only found 6 bone fragment fossils, 2 of which are intact enough for her to use. And notice this. One of the 2 is this complete, although, to use their words, distorted cranium. Would you say that's a distorted cranium?
Yeah.
To me, it looks like it's been run over by a steamroller. But the point being, when you really boil down what all they've got, she has nothing. She's got 2 fossils that are just absolutely fragmented, but because her job and her grant depend on it, she rushed to press, got it published, gave it a new name, and lo and behold, we got a new creature. That's the only picture that we know of that exists of what they, quote, think this guy looks like. Next one, Strelopithecus afarensis. How many of you have heard of this one? All right, let me rephrase it. How many of you in there have heard of Lucy?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is Lucy. Lucy is a unique bird. Lucy is the most complete fossil that we've ever found as far as in one location. Somebody tell me how she got her name.
Beetle song.
There you go. The night that it was discovered, they had a record in the camp. It was, realistically, it was like the only record they had, and they played it over and over, and that happened to be Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. She got her name. She was found by this man, Donald Johanson. He became incredibly famous and subsequently very rich after this discovery. He basically came on board and said, look, I have found the link between apes and humans. Although, we now know that's not necessarily the case. A couple of years ago, we wrote a book called The Truth About Human Origins. If you ever have trouble sleeping, it's a great book. It is 500 pages, hardback, and let me just tell you, it was even painful for me to proofread on occasion. In that particular book, we spent a large portion discussing Lucy. And we'll look at a couple of these real quickly. You'll notice on these 6 points that I have on the screen, I have references beside them. Why do you think I have that?
So people won't think that it's just something you made up.
Right. If I go to a university campus and I'm speaking, on fossil man. I want the college kids there to be able to look up these articles where this information can be found. Like, for instance, Stern and Sussman's finding in 1983. All along we've been told that Lucy was very human-like, and they discovered through measurements that her fingers were curved and that she had ape-like limb proportions. You say, okay, what's the big deal? Curved fingers is only a trait for animals that normally swing in the treetops. Arboreal animals, animals that are not on the ground walking. The next one, number 2, Brian Richmond and David Strait, they were actually in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. They were in a part of the museum where the general public doesn't go very much. It's an area where there are old research papers that are filed away. They came across a paper that talked about the ape-like creatures, primates, having the ability to lock their wrist because they're quadrupeds. And you think about it for just a moment. These are animals that walk on all fours. They're able to actually physically lock their wrist to walk on all fours. They looked at each other and said, you know, I've never seen that in the human fossil record. They walked literally down the hall to where there was a Lucy replica, and guess what she's got? Locking wrist. In fact, let me let you read this. In reporting on it, Maggie Fox said, a chance discovery made by looking at a cast of the bones of Lucy, the most famous fossil of Australopithecus afarensis, shows that her wrist is stiff like a chimpanzee's. This suggests that her ancestors walked on their knuckles. And yet, when Donald Johanson came out, he was telling everybody she walked uprightly like a human. What about a rib cage? Number 4. Anatomically speaking, all humans have a barrel-shaped rib cage. And some of us have got big barrels, others don't, but you all got barrel-shaped rib cages. When Lucy was first presented on the scene, they said she's got a barrel-shaped rib cage. She was on her way to becoming human. Other apes, like chimps, they have a conical-shaped rib cage. It looks, if you were to strip all the flesh away, you'd be looking at what kind of looks like an ice cream cone. Well, Donald Johanson says Lucy's got this barrel-shaped rib cage. Everybody assumes that that's this transition. But I want you to read what a museum curator had to say when they received their Lucy replica. Peter Schmidt, he said, when I started to put the skeleton together, I expected it to look human. Everyone had talked about Lucy being very modern, very human. So I was surprised by what I saw. I noticed that the ribs were more round in cross-section, more like what you see in apes. Human ribs are flatter in cross-section. But the shape of the rib cage itself was the biggest surprise of all. The human rib cage is barrel-shaped. And I just couldn't get Lucy's ribs to fit that kind of shape. But I could get them to make a conical-shaped rib cage like what you see in apes. The last point that I would make, let me pull this one up. Last point I would make is this. Even her pelvis, they've examined her pelvis and done the measurements, and there is no way to physically get a baby through the birth canal. Which means either this wasn't a female, as we've always been told, or it was the last of her species and they all died out because she couldn't reproduce. In other words, we probably ought to be calling, instead of Lucy, we ought to be calling it Lucifer. Let me show you a couple other things about Ms. Lucy. Questions, comments so far?
Hey, Brad?
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, in that Leakey and Lewin book that you quoted from,
Yeah. Yes.
Do they support the finding of Lucy at all? The Leakey family?
No.
Ah. They didn't
No,
get
they
the
don't,
money on that one, did they?
But the main reason is competition.
Yep.
You know. All right. This is, give you guys a little bit of in-depth stuff on Lucy. There is what is often shown as the original findings. There's Johansson. That shows the area where Lucy was found. 1974. Said the femur was angled, proving Lucy was becoming human. So you see man there on the left, Lucy in the middle, ape on the right. You'll notice how an ape's leg is more vertical, more straight up and down, whereas man, you've got this kind of an arched angle. And yet when we start looking at it, we say, okay, tree climbing monkeys have angled femurs. They're not on their way to becoming human, so maybe there's other explanations. We know that Lucy's knee was slightly bigger than a regular ape's, according to Johansson. So how do we answer that? We say, well, could it be that this was an ape that was just simply slightly bigger? Do we have slightly bigger horses? Absolutely. Does that prove that it's evolving into a dinosaur? Not exactly. You got big horses and you got little horses. Just because you find a bone that's a little bit bigger doesn't mean that it's evolving, does it? This is a picture. This is actually a display in St. Louis Zoo. They have, it really drives me crazy. It's called The Living World. It's an entire room that is a shrine to Charles Darwin. And in that room, they've got a life-size, full-size statue of what they think Lucy looked like. And so here you see the bottom part of it. She's furry. Here's her knee, her feet. And yet, if you think about it for just a moment, they didn't find any bones below about right here. How do they know what her feet look like? Or how do they know? See, there's her bones. How do you know what this right here looks like if you don't have any bone below? This is the knee joint right here. David Minton said that it's a complete misrepresentation, that I believe they know it's a misrepresentation, and yet when they went to Bruce Carr, the guy who is at the zoo, and they said, look, you guys are exhibiting something you know is wrong. Here's what he says. Zoo officials have no plans to knuckle under. We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. We look at the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. What would you say to that? Guys, that's not true science. That's Hollywood.
That's right.
Because they have no way of knowing what this thing looks like. But it's all about impression. It's about being able to sell that story. Okay, let's look at this for just a minute. This is the picture that we associate with Lucy a lot. We see it a lot in magazines and books. But if you look right here for just a moment, these are 8 different published things of Lucy. You'll notice you got some in National Geographic. These are all in books. That one's in a book. Oops, back up. Others down here, I've got them covered up, but some are in encyclopedias. The question is, would the real Lucy please stand up? Because when you start looking at these and realize these have been published as being Lucy. Take a look at the jawbones for just a minute. They're all different. How about ribs? Not only are they different, guys, you got different numbers of ribs. You know, the point being, who in the world knows which one is the real one? You got ribs going up, you got ribs going down. You got some with finger bones, you got some without. Spinal column, if you look at it, some of them have got very well-defined vertebral column. Some of them don't. And yet these have been published in National Geographic, a book called Human Origins, The Search for Our Beginning, Cambridge Encyclopedia of Human Evolution. I mean, it's a joke if you really think about it, that basically they're now just sketching out whatever they want. This is the quote that you need to be aware of. 1996, Donald Johanson finally gave up and admitted that Lucy was recently dethroned, meaning this was no longer his beloved missing link. I honestly think because of that, that's one reason why we're getting Artie again. Because the media, the textbooks, they need some kind of a torch bearer for evolution. Lucy used to be that torch bearer. She is no longer the torch bearer. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Brad,
I'll show you that. Go ahead.
I find it interesting. I'm from St. Louis, and that St. Louis Zoo has always been a free zoo. You don't have to pay to get in. And so it's taxpayer supported. And then I also find out that remark from that director was from '96, same time frame that Johansson came out with his remark. But
yes.
that tells me that the city of St. Louis or whoever gathers the tax money, they're very bent on wanting to make sure that evolution is taught, regardless of if it, you don't have to pay to get in, but they're going to, just like the public school system, they're going to do what
we're going to teach you.
Yeah, they do what they can to corrupt you. So.
Absolutely. Think about the timeline here for just a moment, guys. He founded in 1974. 1974 to 1980, he was a very powerful, wealthy, famous individual. 1981, actually in 1980, people started really questioning because they were finally able to start looking at the bones themselves and making measurements. And that because the way it happens in science, basically, the person who makes the discovery, they've got sole rights for a long period of time. And they can publish and they can make money. But after these articles start coming out and you start getting this power and this money and this wealth, pretty soon somebody's going to speak up and say, wait a second, I'd like to at least make sure that what you're saying is the same interpretation that I would see if I looked at these bones. So eventually, a scientist knows they've got to share their stuff. And indeed he did, and indeed people started really questioning it. And here's what Donald Johanson said in 1981. I was trying to jam evidence of dates into a pattern that would support conclusions about fossils which, he goes on to say, the fossils themselves would not support. Do we still use these past errors? Absolutely. Let me see. There's another quote I was wanting to show you, but it's not on here. How about this one? Somebody tell me what you think was the greatest paleontological find of the 20th century. It wasn't Lucy. It was footprints. The reason I call this the greatest find is because to me it is the most telling, but it's the one that your kids are never ever going to see in a textbook. Let me back out and show you another picture of it. Here we go. So here's Meve Leakey. 1979 National Geographic. If you notice, she is taking measurements of these footprints. It's called the Laetoli footprints. What do you notice about them just in looking at them? If you can tell, you may not be able to even see. You'll be able to see. I'll post these PowerPoints and you'll be able to see these pictures a lot better. Long story short, you got multiple footprints here. You got, looks like big prints on this side, smaller prints here. That was the picture that appeared in that issue of National Geographic. Why do you think in this issue of National Geographic, which, by the way, I would point out again, somebody tell me, is this not, get back to what I was talking about with racism? I mean, when you think about it, you've got these two dark-skinned people, or three dark-skinned people. Why do you guys think that the artist of this National Geographic put an infant in this person's arms?
To explain the small footprint.
Okay. We got small footprints, but we got small footprints inside of the big footprints. Tell me what happens if, let's say that it snows in Denver, Colorado. You got small children, you go out to get the mail, you got your galoshes on, your children open the door, they see the snow, they come busting out, they don't have on any, they don't have their coats and their hats and everything on, they just come running out, and they see your footprints. What do?
They
Follow your tracks.
Definitely.
Human beings, guys, are the only animal on the planet who will intentionally step into other footprints. There's not any other animal, period. Scientific fact, can't refute it. In this particular set of prints, what they found were adult tracks with a small set of tracks inside of it. So, here we go. Mary Leakey, in trying to explain it, she says, the prints in one of the trails did indeed turn out to be a double, as Lewis and I and several others had expected. And at last we understood the reason, namely that three hominids had been present. I'll simply summarize here by saying that we appear to have the prints left 3.5 million years ago by three individuals of a different stature. It is tempting to see them as a man, a woman, and a child. Okay, that explains the picture. But here's the problem. She dated the volcanic ash that these tracks were in at 3.5 million years ago. Okay? And yet she's got a man, a woman, and what she thinks are a child, and a child that is deliberately walking in the footsteps of the parents. That has only ever been recorded in humans. There's not an evolutionist in the world that is going to say humans, that Homo sapiens have been here for 3.5 million years. They would say we came from Neanderthals, and Neanderthals came from Homo habilis, and Homo habilis came from Australopithecus. She's putting this particular set of footprints basically right around the time of Lucy, which means you would have basically Lucy and modern man at the same time. David Minton, he said, in a recent lecture at St. Louis, Mary Leakey pointed out one additional feature of her footprints that one does not often see mentioned in the literature. All of the larger footprints of the trail have a smaller footprint superimposed on them. Mary Leakey herself concluded that it appears that a child was intentionally lengthening its stride to step in the elder's footprints. It shouldn't be necessary to emphasize that this is a far more sophisticated behavior than one expects from apes. Leakey found herself trapped because she had already published a paper on that site dating it at 3.5 million years. She'd already said, hey, this ash, it's 3.5 million years old. Well, lo and behold, we found footprints. Oh, and we found a child intentionally lengthening its stride, something only humans do, in these ash which by default would mean those footprints were laid down 3.5 million years ago. So Leakey is then stuck with trying to figure out what to call this thing. She ended up calling, you know how we have two scientific names. We have genus, species. She called them genus Homo, just like Homo sapiens, like us. Species indeterminate. Why didn't she just call them Homo sapiens? Because that means you would have had modern man living at the same time as Lucy, which would have literally undone the whole idea that we evolved from any kind of Lucy-like creature. Russell Tuttle was asked to go look at him. Tuttle is a man who... I'll let you guys take a break. We'll come back in a few minutes.